Thank you very much. The last session, but not least. Actually, Geoffrey Hinton, he was very kind to introduce, I think, this topic when he spoke about motherly AI. Because what is behind motherly AI? I think he said basically alignment, which is all important, governance is important, even advanced reasoning or abstract reasoning will not help maybe in the long run when AI becomes maybe super intelligent, ubiquitous. So the system itself must have in-baked some behavior which is beneficial for us, for humanity. So we cannot just rely on human itself, so AI needs to do that. And it's actually not a question of whether a system like AI become conscious. Because if you think of not an abstract intelligence, but an emotional intelligence, is somehow kind of linked intrinsically to a physical reality, to some causality, right? It's like to have a hurricane, you model it, but you don't become wet. And I think this is what he meant. So it must be kind of ingrained in the system to be kind. Actually, when he was just visiting China, he spoke about kind AI. So that was his introduction. So actually, to focus on that or to question this, whether it could become conscious, this actually is nothing less than the question of humankind itself, of humanity, about the nature of reality, of life. And I don't focus so much on AI itself, but on the question of consciousness. And this fills libraries, of course. And this question of what makes us conscious, what makes us alive, of course, is a question I think exists since humanity exists. So myself, briefly, thank you for the introduction. I'm by training, actually, did information science of engineering. Then I switched to philosophy. I think in that intersection, actually, I work a lot in digital and AI governance, but also those questions, deeper question. I'm also a visiting professor at the Chinese Academy of Science in the Aerospace Institute there. So now to have actually, these are not competing dimensions, but maybe to have some categories when you engage, or when I engage in this discussion, to locate, what could it mean, consciousness, and then maybe what could it then mean if I can become conscious? I think this is how maybe you should take those categories I'm suggesting, like as frames or point of departure in getting into it. And I don't want to present them as competing, but some are certainly competing categories, but more as different perspective, just because we don't know, right? That's very important here. And I would start with the emergent one and go straight into basically the brain, if you wish. So the emergent perspective, physicalist realism, is the dominant view. So basically here, the mental states, they emerge from matter, from the genomics, from the connectonomics, from the electrical processing in the brain. So the mind, our mind, is secondary. It's an epiphenomenon. And it actually was long ignored, the mind or consciousness, in research. Because I, the observer, can know reality, but I, the observer, is not part of my analysis of that reality. So it was excluded. And he is also in this, let's say, tradition, in this materialist tradition, in this realist tradition, basically, where I can know the reality, what it is. I can measure it, I can observe it, I can predict it. Came up this hard problem. Actually, the hard problem is not just from David Chalmers. The hard problem is known, but I think it's not the full story of the issue. But the hard problem basically says, how can from something which is quantitative become a quality? How comes that the whole is more than the sum of the parts? That some physically processes through the dynamics create an identity that pursues goals and has a plan in life, etc. So from less becomes more. So from non-conscious units, they become conscious. That's unexplained. So that is basically the hard problem. And when then you ask the question from this perspective, and on the left side, and sorry, there's a lot always on those slides. I try to, just to try to provide as many information as possible. Basically, would say, could I simulate consciousness like on a machine or somewhere? It's basically like kind of a no, but we still try doing it anyway, right? So it's kind of not possible, but there's the mainstream then idea, like let's say in neuroscience, there are no extra non-physical realities. So the mind is still reducible to physical processes. So if I search hard enough, I might then basically at one point maybe make something conscious. So that's it. Then there's something they look at on the quantum level, like Sir Penrose. They say, oh, this is on the quantum level in the tubules of the brain within inside the neuron. And basically, we can't compute it. We don't know, but we're still doing the research. So this is a kind of a yes, no, but. But any of this approach bypasses the hard problem, right? How can something from less more emerge? And when what actually emerges is this I think I am, the cogito of Descartes. And kind of antithetical to the realist approach is a universalist approach, or the idealism. And I myself, I'm German, I'm from Berlin. Germany is kind of the home from German idealism. And if you always have tried to understand what is the essence of Immanuel Kant, it's very easy. There's only subjectivity. There is no objective reality. There's only subjectivity. The question is how we still get some objective truth out of this. But when we look at the topic of what is consciousness, then there's a little bit of reversal, because from a universalist perspective, you don't have the problem that you have units of consciousness and then they merge into a single stream of awareness. Well, how is that possible? Because probably it's not possible. They say there must be a consciousness at large, a universal mind. And what does it mean, basically? That our mind, our individual consciousness, is a dissociation of the universal mind. So at birth, it dissociates from the universal mind. It creates kind of an instance, an alter. It's not a separate reality. It's just kind of, we're just an interface for that. And upon death, it's not that our mental process stops. It reassociates with the mind at large. And actually, it's just the end of the illusion of being separate. It's the end of the illusion of having a self. For those who meditate, for those who do try all kinds of things, sometimes you try, of course, to de-ego, to de-self yourself, and you might have this moment, and I think this is kind of the thinking behind that. It's, of course, empirically very hard to test scientifically, but that's approach. So here, actually, the hard problem is not why does mind emerges from matter, but here actually the hard problem is baked in the premise itself, why a subjective unit of experience is a condition for a coherent experience of the object. So everything we perceive as rational objective is on the layer of the subjective. From that, and I tried to capture it in this picture, actually, that the apple you see is the appearance, right? And has maybe somewhere in this unknown space some equivalent we can't access, we can't know, because it's a matter of resolution. When you go into quantum level, you will not see the apple anymore, right? So what is there? We don't know, basically. And what's happening in your brain is a representation of that appearance. And our subjectivity combines this into a single stream, and our subject escapes that. So it must be somewhere, our subject must be somewhere in this unknown space. That's the reason why we can't access it. It escapes, basically. And what does science do? Science tries to describe the apple, but can only do in a negative way, hypothesis verification. It cannot designate the apple in a positive sense. It can only make assumptions and then say, and rule out, to refuse the null hypothesis. So only in the negative way. So that's quite telling, because the research always stands on the subject, which itself is not taking into account. When you ask now, from a universalist perspective, can this be computed is a category no. Because the subject actually, or the space-time, which is the basic categories, is already a construct. There's no space-time. And actually, you have approaches in quantum physics, which are called positive geometry or high-energy theories, which go post-space-time approaches. So if the subject already presupposes space-time, there must be something beyond that, right? So you can't compute it. So because every approach to compute consciousness implies already consciousness. So from this perspective, it's a no. Or makes it also very hard to actually test. Then the multi-scale approach. This is a quite interesting. This is the most empirical one, I would say, we have. It is kind of in between. I explained in briefly what you see in this video. It's kind of in between the realist and the universalist. But it leans more towards the realist one, the first one I explained, the empirical one. And it does it as follows. It puts actually agency as a center of observation. So, and a mind is an agent, basically. And you have this agency, this mindful activity already on not just on the brain level, on the subcellular level. So when cells, organisms try to solve problems, and they're very good problem solvers. And each cell alone will not do it, but in the collective, so mind is decentralized, coordinated collective, that will sort out the problem. And sometimes the individual cell does not know it will become a hand. So in this collective, they will say, okay, it will become like that. But more interesting, what you see here on this image, it's a leaf. And I think this is not from an oak tree, but there are different kind of leaves. And then you have insects, and this guy was a little insect, and it puts some liquid, tries to inject it into the leaf. And actually, this red, whatever it is, organism you see there is not in the DNA of the leaf. But how comes that the leaf is producing that? So basically, this little insect, they know where to inject this liquid in order to use the leaf, the mechanisms, the proteins to build something. But the structure, the form, is not stored in the leaf. And we don't know where it's stored. And actually, one who is researching this a lot is Michael Levin. Maybe some of you have heard about him. And he thinks first that, and you see this on this picture now, that actually there must be maybe this kind of Platonic space of forms and minds, which is pulled in, basically, when on a very micro level already, problems are solved. Yeah? And we don't know. It's for an empirist who does empirical biological or biochemistry research, it's quite a big leap to say there's a Platonic space, right? So we don't know. But they found out they can manipulate cells on these ion channels, basically, and say to this worm, grow 2 heads. Then the worm grows 2 heads, and so forth. So they can do it. So it's not about printing a heart. It's just to instruct the cell, make a heart. It's quite a hack. So I think this confirms a little bit the emergent approach from the first one, that actually the intelligence is somehow still connected to the physical reality. But then he also says that some of the problem solving must come from somewhere else. We know that biology uses natural laws in chemistry, in physics, and borrows that. But there must be maybe more to this with solving problems. And that's quite interesting. But from his perspective, if you ask the question, could we actually simulate from this perspective consciousness, he would say no. But what we could do, because he also sees that the mind operating, let's say, on a cellular, subcellular, multicellular levels, basically are deeply ingrained physical process. So this is one problem. And the other problem is this Platonic space. So how do we simulate that space? Does today an LLM has access to this Platonic space? Actually, he is not sure whether those LLMs have such capacity. But you could also say it's just a complexity issue. So if complex systems make all kinds of things, but it doesn't mean there is a kind of a mystical secret place behind that. The fourth one now, I think that's pretty straightforward. It basically says, yes, you can simulate that. And actually, I have to say that this is probably the least pretentious approach in terms of seeing humanity special in this universe, right? The other, when we say, oh, consciousness, maybe it's a base unit of quantum physics, put actually humanity in the center of the universe. It's quite pretentious to do that, right? Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but here it's pretty straightforward. It's a functionalist approach, so it's not asking what is the mind, but what does it? So here in this perspective, basically, it can be simulated on a substrate which supports or has the properties where a mind can run. It's not an emergent approach where the matter produces it. It is an approach, no, you have the simulation and which matter fits for me. It's like running an LLM and an H100 NVIDIA chip. It's better than running it on a H20 chip or whatever. So in that way, it's like playing Minecraft. So when you open the computer, you will not see the Minecraft, but it still runs as a software. So that's the assumption behind that. So basically, then you look at it, then it forces you really to describe what is consciousness from a phenomenological perspective, but also from a functional one. From a phenomenological perspective, it's a stream of presence, a continuous, coherent nowness, including the space of time and space, and has also sensory content. It is a kind of a second-order perception. We sense ourselves sensing. Actually, the eye cannot see itself seeing, right? So that's a big difference with the brain being a sense organ, but can self-sensing. And from a functional perspective, basically, very important also that we build the self. The self and the world model are basically instances, separate simulation in this respect. The function, basically, it would be that the consciousness is a coherence-inducing, so we need coherence. Colonizing, or self-organizing, colonizing. Colonizing, why colonizing? If something breaks down, the plasticity, like in the brain, takes over something else. And you see it also in the brain. So there are some parts of the brain that are specialized, but others could take it over. That's very interesting, right? So they can take over, and in this way, you must model it in the same way. It's a significance filter. The consciousness is about significance. So if something is insignificant, you feel yourself, you get bored, you actually shut down. So it's very important how the consciousness works. It looks at significant things. And the significance here, that's a little bit tricky, is of course, it's charged by values. You know, it's not a natural process. So the mind-matter relations, as said, it just runs on a substrate or substrate independent. So it could actually run on any substrate if the substrate has the properties to support those functions of the mind, right? So obviously, this approach contradicts all other views. It makes it a little bit suspicious. But it actually forces you to really think through what it is. And I would say, from my perspective, actually, that artificial intelligence here is not just a question whether it becomes conscious, but it's a great tool to test those empirically. Because with which tools can you test this question? There are not many, right? So in the universalists, you can only philosophize about that, but you can get quite far. But actually here, you can even try to overcome the bridge or the gap between mathematics and experience, because mathematics cannot capture experience. And because math is a stateless system, and the mind is not stateless, it's very dynamic, or the organism is very dynamic, and you could actually model such dynamism with AI. So in this way, actually, AI is very interesting. Before concluding, maybe to locate where we are with AI. Basically, on the left side, you see the human, and we have this representation, we have the phenomenon, and we have the real on the bottom, the real we cannot access, right? And the subject, the subjectivity, embraces this phenomenon on the representation into a coherent, and maybe our subjective core is somehow located in the unknown. That's the reason why we have so problem to access that. And actually, to access it could be irreducible. That would mean for some quantum physicists, they would say, we have to calculate the whole universe, like in brute force, step by step, in order to model consciousness. Should consciousness be a unit, a core unit of the universe, right? So if there's no, for the other approach, basically, for the simulated approach, I would say, learning presupposes mind. And learning starts very early, so consciousness could be a very simple algorithm, because it needs to, and usually nature and universe is very resource efficient, right? So why do we need all this compute? Maybe there's a really resource efficient aspect in that. So when you look now at on the right side, the different AIs, now the disembodied, the LLMs basically, they only operate on the representation level. These are representation of representations. Language, it did not learn from the phenomenon, from having sounds, gestures, and writing, where you then actually engage with physical reality, but it just learned abstracted data top-down. So it's a complete different way how we learn language. It's actually physically ingrained, and the LLM's not, right? So it operates only on this disembodied representational layer. However, now we are coming to this embodied AI and to a sensory AI. What happens now, that actually the phenomenological layer in the middle is added, because it will sense the world and it will also alter the world. Actually, it builds a model of appearance. So it already has both. But where we combine both levels in our subjectivity, the gap now between the representation and the phenomenon is just a functional layer, right? So it's actually, and Geoffrey Hinton is quite concerned about this kind of subjectivity. So these AIs develop a subjectivity, but it is an artificial subjectivity. It is not a conscious one. Very important. And on the right side, this is the speculation. What happens actually if it is embodied and conscious? And to conclude, I will not go through everything. To conclude, there are two things where you maybe measure consciousness, whether like artificial consciousness. One is on the behavior side, and the other one is on the substrate side. On the behavior, the system will do everything what you say, well, this is conscious, right? And I always, a little bit cynical, say, if you have a killing robot behind you, you don't ask a question. You say, this thing is conscious, because it's after me. It will try to get me. But you see today already, I think this was what LLMs can already do. I mean, was supposed to do only by humankind, right? The second layer is the substrate. So in order to really know not that the system is cheating me, it's just imitating consciousness, actually our brain must connect to that system to feel whether it's really conscious. And that's a little bit an issue, but I think that would be the ultimate test, whether a system is waking up or not. Let me conclude. I think I believe, I don't know whether I want this system to become conscious or not, but I think if it has some simulation of self-awareness, some deep simulation of self-awareness, and it's very important to kind of simulate what it could all mean. Maybe it's easier then to understand us, what is for us important inside us, and to relate better to what is important. Because the problem is with morality. Even morality is universal, so you don't deceive, you don't do those things. These are universal values, but they're always contextual. In China, it's different than in the United States or in Europe or where else. We share probably the same values, but they're implemented in a different way, in a culturally, historically mediated way. And this you cannot hard code a line. So that's the reason why actually it is maybe not bad if a system becomes conscious in that way, if it has already this super intelligence. Thank you very much.